There was a contract in your household. Nobody wrote it down. Nobody signed it. Nobody acknowledged it existed, but everyone followed it, especially you. The contract had rules. Don't outshine the parent. Don't have needs that compete with theirs. Don't feel things they haven't authorized. Don't question the narrative. Don't be too much. Don't be too little. Be exactly what they need you to be in the exact moment they need it, and never ask why. This is the invisible contract of a narcissistic household, not a household with a difficult parent. A household with a parent who is operating a system where one person's needs organize the emotional reality of everyone else in the house, where the child's job was not to grow, but to orbit, not to become a self, but to become a function in someone else's story. And the contract didn't expire when you moved out. It didn't dissolve when you turned 18 or got your own apartment or built your own life. The rules are still running, and how you relate, how you apologize, how you doubt yourself, how you walk through rooms hoping nobody notices you're taking up space. In this video, we're looking at 10 things adults do when they were raised inside this contract. And for each one, we'll trace the rule as it was taught in the household, and the now, the behavior it still produces in adulthood. Because the contract was never about you being wrong. It was about the system needing you to be small. Number 1, you navigate relationships the way you'd navigate a minefield. Carefully, strategically, always calculating the safest next step. Then, the household required constant emotional monitoring. The narcissistic parent's mood was unpredictable, and the consequences of triggering a shift were severe. Not always visibly, but emotionally. A wrong word, a wrong tone, a moment of being too visible could turn the entire atmosphere hostile, so the child learned to walk on eggshells. Not metaphorically, neurologically. The nervous system adapted to treat every interaction as potentially dangerous. Now, you walk on eggshells everywhere. With your partner who has never given you a reason to. With your friends who would be confused to know you're monitoring them. With your boss, your neighbors, your server at a restaurant. The eggshell walking transferred from the one person who was genuinely volatile to every person in your life. Because the nervous system doesn't distinguish between the parent who punished missteps and the partner who wouldn't. It runs the same protocol for both. Number 2, you feel something, anger, hurt, disappointment, and your first response is not to feel it, but to question it. Am I allowed to feel this? Is this reasonable? Am I overreacting? Then, your feelings were not treated as information. They were treated as inconveniences. The narcissistic parent responded to the child's emotions with dismissal, you're being dramatic, minimization, it's not that bad, or weaponization, you're too sensitive, that's your problem. The child learned, my feelings are not data, they are defects, and the defect is in me, not in the situation. Now every emotion passes through a validation checkpoint before you'll trust it. You feel hurt and immediately build a case for why the hurt is legitimate, as if the feeling needs evidence to exist. And if the case isn't strong enough, you dismiss your own feeling before anyone else can. You became your own invalidator, because the system taught you that trusting your emotions without external permission was dangerous. And the cruelest version of this, you start to believe the parent's framing was correct. Maybe I am too sensitive. Maybe I am overreacting. Maybe the problem is me. You don't just doubt the feeling, you doubt the feeler. And that doubt, planted so early, reinforced so consistently, becomes the background noise of your entire emotional life. Every feeling arrives with an asterisk. This might not be real. Number 3, you don't just state things, you defend them. preemptively, exhaustively. Then, anything you said could be used against you. In the narcissistic household, words were not neutral. They were ammunition. A casual comment could be reinterpreted, stored, and deployed later as evidence of your failure, your ingratitude, your selfishness. So the child learned, if I'm going to say something, I need to build a fortress around it first. Explain the context, justify the position, preempt the counterattack. Now, your texts are essays, your emails are dissertations. You can't answer a simple question without providing background, context, disclaimers, and qualifications. Not because you're thorough, because the part of you that lived in the narcissistic household still believes that undefended statements are vulnerable statements. And vulnerable in that household meant targetable. The over-explanation isn't communication. It's armor left over from a war that ended years ago. Number 4. You need something. Rest, attention, help, space, and guilt arise before the need can fully form. Then, your needs were treated as competition. In the narcissistic household, there was only enough emotional bandwidth for one person's needs, and that person was the parent. When the child needed something, it was framed as an imposition. After everything I do for you, you're so demanding. Do you know how hard I work? The child's need wasn't met. It was redirected back to the parent's need, and the message was clear: needing things is selfish. Having needs is a character flaw. Now, you can't need anything without an apology attached. You ask for help and immediately say, "I'm sorry to bother you." You take a day off and feel like you need to justify it to the universe. The guilt isn't proportional to the need. It's proportional to the original punishment for needing. And that punishment was so consistent, so subtle, and so early that your system now treats every need as evidence that you're asking too much of the world. You're not, but the contract says you are. Number 5. You walk into a room and immediately scan for who's upset. Then, the narcissistic parent's mood was the law of the household. When they were pleased, the house was warm. When they were displeased, the house was a courtroom. And the child, who had no control over the parent's emotions but bore the consequences of them, learned to monitor constantly. Not to understand the parent, to predict them. Because prediction was the only available form of control in a system where the child had no actual power. Now, everyone's mood feels like your weather. A friend's tension at dinner makes your chest tighten. A partner's silence makes you inventory everything you've done in the last hour. A coworker's bad day becomes your emotional homework. The monitoring is exhausting because it was designed for one volatile person and is now running for every person you encounter. You are a weather station built for a hurricane that is scanning for storms in every drizzle. And the people around you don't know you're monitoring them. They see someone attentive, someone caring, someone who notices when they're off. They don't know the noticing isn't generosity. It's a leftover from a household where not noticing the parent's mood meant walking into an ambush you could have prevented. The hypervigilance looks like love. It's actually a sentry that was never relieved of duty. Number 6. Someone says something kind about you and you deflect. Someone says something critical and it embeds immediately. Then, praise in the narcissistic household was strategic, not sincere. It arrived when the parent needed something from you, or when an audience was watching, or as the prelude to a reversal. You're so smart, so why can't you do this right? Praise was the lobby. Criticism was the destination. So the child learned, positive words are unreliable. They're setting something up. The criticism, however, was constant and unconditional. It needed no context, no setup, no audience. It just arrived, reliably. Now compliments bounce off you and criticism sticks. Not because criticism is more accurate, Because your system was calibrated to treat criticism as the real signal and praise as noise. The calibration was set in a household where praise was noise, strategic, manipulative, unreliable. The criticism, cruel as it was, at least felt consistent, and the nervous system trusts consistency over kindness. It always has. Number 7, without a role to play or a person to adapt to, you feel undefined. Then, the narcissistic parent defined you, not openly, systemically. They decided which version of you was acceptable and which was not. Your interests were validated or dismissed based on whether they served the parent's narrative. Your personality was shaped by what kept the parent comfortable, and the child who should have been developing a self was instead developing a function, the version of them that the parent could tolerate. Now, you don't know your own preferences without referencing someone else. You choose what to watch, what to eat, what to want based on what the people around you want. And when you're alone, truly alone with no one to mirror, you feel a particular emptiness that isn't loneliness. It's the absence of a self that was never allowed to develop independently. The narcissistic parent didn't just control you. They occupied the space where your identity was supposed to grow. And now that they're not in the room, the space is still empty. And when people say, just be yourself, the instruction lands differently for someone whose self was occupied territory. Be myself? Which version? The one the parent built? The one I perform at work? The one I think people want? The question, who am I, is not philosophical for children of narcissistic parents. It's genuinely unanswered, because the answer was never allowed to develop. Number 8, you say sorry for taking up space, for having opinions, for being in the way, for being. Then, your existence was welcomed only when it served the parent. When you were useful, quiet, flattering, or invisible, you were tolerated. When you were loud, needy, opinionated, or simply yourself, you were a problem. Not because anything was wrong with you, because the system required the child to be an accessory, not a protagonist. And accessories that draw too much attention are replaced. Now, you move through the world like you're borrowing space. You apologize in doorways. You shrink in conversations. You qualify your presence with, if it's okay, and I don't want to be a bother. The apologizing isn't politeness. It's the residue of a childhood where being too present was an offense, where the message, spoken or unspoken, was, your presence is acceptable only when it's convenient for me, and you still move through rooms asking permission to exist in them. Number 9, you look at your relationships and see the pattern. You keep ending up with people who make you feel small. Then, the narcissistic dynamic was the template for love. The parent who needed constant attention, who made everything about themselves, who could be warm and then cold without warning. This was not an anomaly in the child's life. It was life. The instability wasn't a feature of the relationship. It was the relationship. And the child's nervous system filed it under normal. Now, emotionally healthy people feel boring. Partners who are consistent feel flat. People who give without taking feel suspicious, because the template says love is something you earn through performance, something that can be revoked without warning, and something that costs you more than it gives you. When someone offers love freely, your system flags it as error. That's not how love works, the system says. Love is supposed to be harder than this, and so you gravitate toward the hard, toward the dynamic you recognize, not because you enjoy it, because the nervous system trusts what it knows, even when what it knows is a contract designed to keep you small. And the recognition, when it comes, is one of the most painful moments in healing, looking at your relationship history and seeing the narcissistic parent's face reflected in every partner, every boss, every close friend who made you feel small, not because you're broken, Because the template was installed before you had the capacity to question it, and by the time you could question it, it already felt like home. Number 10. You are a grown adult, and you still manage your parents' feelings, or if not your parent, someone who has taken their place in the contract. Then, the child was the parent's emotional regulator, not their support system, their regulator. When the parent was upset, the child soothed. When the parent was angry, the child absorbed. When the parent was disappointed, the child performed. The parent's emotional state was the child's assignment, updated daily, graded harshly, and never voluntarily. Now, you still carry this assignment. A phone call from your parent fills you with the specific dread of someone about to report for duty. You calculate what mood they'll be in before you answer. You edit what you share to avoid triggering a reaction. And even if you've created distance, physical, emotional, or both, the contract runs. Because the contract wasn't about proximity. It was about programming. And programs don't care how far away the original coder lives. And the most exhausting part, you do this while simultaneously knowing it's not your job. The awareness and the compulsion coexist. You know you're not responsible for their feelings, and you still manage them. That gap between what you know and what you do is where the invisible contract lives, not in your logic, in your wiring. If you recognize the invisible contract in these 10 signs, the reframe that matters most is this. The contract was never about you being wrong. It was about the system needing you to be small. Small enough to orbit. Small enough not to compete. Small enough to serve the parent's story without writing your own. But you're not in the orbit anymore. And the contract that served the household is not serving your life. You can begin to notice the moments when the contract activates. When you shrink. When you apologize for existing. When you monitor a room that isn't dangerous and name them for what they are. Old rules running in a new world. The rules can't be unlearned in a day, but they can be seen. And once you see a rule, it stops looking like truth and starts looking like programming. And programming, unlike personality, can be updated. If you're in the process of identifying these patterns and want a way to track them day by day, our Inner Lens Healing Tracker, exclusive for members, helps you log the moments when old rules fire, when boundaries hold, and when the contract starts losing its grip. You can join using the Join button below. At Inner Lens, we read the contracts nobody told you were signed. If this one resonated, the next video goes into the practical side. How to start reparenting the child who grew up inside this system. It's right here.